Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I'm joined by Will Castle. Will is a mental health advocate, suicide prevention campaigner, and executive producer. In 2010, Will lost his father to suicide. It took 10 years for him to start speaking about his experience, and now he's made it his mission to make a difference. So welcome, Will.
Hey, Philip. Thank you for having me.
So, Will, perhaps you can tell us, what was life like in your younger years as you were growing up?
So, yeah, I lived quite a mad childhood, actually. A childhood that I was very privileged to lead. It did come with its challenges, but my dad was the type of person who was all or nothing. He made fortunes and lost fortunes several times over. So there were times where I was living a life of absolute luxury. Private boats, private planes, private school, a life that people would dream of. But there was always this underlying fear that, as amazing as my life was from all these sort of superficial things, that, my parents weren't together. I have no memory of my parents ever being together. They split from a very, very early age. And I was sort of between houses the whole time, dealing with conflict between them. So it was a muddled childhood. I had a half sister who I didn't really meet until I was 7. And yeah, it's sort of the stuff that's sort of almost in film and TV show, I suppose. It was quite bizarre looking back on it. And it's sort of, for a young boy, it was quite confusing, to be perfectly honest. I didn't know whether I was coming or going. And it's only now I look back and I realize that, my parents tried their best to sort of keep me within this sheltered childhood. And yeah, it was lovely. It really was. But my dad was a very strict, very strict and to some extent quite aggressive parent, but he was also the fun one. So my mum did all the parenting and, you've got to go to school, do your homework. Whereas my dad was sort of like, let me drink beer when I was 13 and that sort of thing. So that sort of sets up how sort of bizarre and unusual my childhood was, I guess.
Before, we come to November 2010, what was your life like?
So I was living with my mum, and I almost lived two very distinctive lives. So my mum lived a very normal, in inverted commas, normal life. Went to school. But then I had this sort of bizarre, unique upbringing that happened on the weekends when I went to visit Dad. So my dad played professional polo. So I would be going to Guards Polo Club, meeting the Queen when Dad was receiving prizes from the Queen. So if you see on my website, you'll see all the photos of him meeting the Queen and getting all sorts of accolades for that. Going on a trip in his private plane or going to buy a brand new car with him. And it was so bizarre that I would do all of that on the weekend, Sunday night, go back home to my mum, and then just live this normal, life like everyone else. And I didn't really realize how crazy it was at the time. And then, as I got older, I understood it a bit more. And then I went off to university. And when I went to university, I realized that, post 2007, that my dad was going through a lot of financial trouble. Things weren't as straightforward as they were prior to 2007, after the great financial crisis. And it was little things that sort of started being a bit weird. Like, I would never have to ever remind my dad to pay any bill or anything like that. But then I'd be getting letters from the university saying my fees weren't paid, or I'd be getting a knock on the door from the landlord saying my rent wasn't paid. And that did start kind of ringing alarm bells in my head that perhaps things weren't as great as I thought that they were.
Did you ever talk to your dad about this? Did you ever?
No. So the message, my dad was your stereotypical, what we describe, nowadays as macho man to some extent, he had a lot of toxic masculinity in his personality. He would never ask for help. He would never show any signs of weakness. He would never show any signs of vulnerability. And he would keep all of this bottled up inside. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was this confident, wealthy, successful, man's man who nothing would disturb him or trouble him. And he could take on all the responsibility for his family, and his friends and whatever is needed. So there was no sign of weakness whatsoever, ever. And that, I believe, ultimately led to his, tragic downfall. Because back then, in 2007, 2008, men didn't talk about their feelings, and still don't to some extent. But he very much kept everything he was going through under wraps, and I didn't discover anything realistically until after he passed.
So tell us about what happens in 2010 then. I know you've written a lot about this, but perhaps you can tell us about what happened on that day.
So I went to work like I did every normal day. I published my story, which is the written events of this day, but I'm gonna walk you through it a little bit now. And essentially, looking back, how strange it was is because it started like every other normal day. Woke up, I had a shower, I went to work. I spoke to my dad on the phone in the morning on my way to work, just checking in, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. That phone call, checking in, how's your day? What have you got? What you up to? That was the last ever time I spoke to my dad. And I tried to. He called me and we spoke a lot. We spoke, 8 to 10 times a day. And he called me in the morning. I missed it. And then I tried to call him back and it went straight to voicemail. And that is that phone call it haunts me for the rest of my life because I didn't take that phone call. And that could have been the phone call that was, I need help. And I missed it. And that will live with me for the rest of my life. And nothing was going through my head about it. I couldn't get hold of him for a few hours, but no alarm bells were ringing or anything like that. And then I was out for dinner. I got a phone call from one of his friends telling me he'd been made bankrupt, asking me if I'd seen him that day, which I hadn't. And I went round the whole of London looking for him. And eventually my phone ran out of battery. I knew where his car was parked and the porter had the key. The porter let me into the car. I charged my phone. While I was charging my phone, I was listening to the radio and I heard that there'd been an incident, a customer incident on the tracks at Bond Street, and which was where I was at the time. And I thought to myself, no, not a chance. It's him, but let me go and sort of check it out anyway. Then I went to the station. They told me to call the British Transport Police, which I did. And I called the British Transport Police and I explained to them why I was calling them. And they literally said to me, yeah, it's your dad. He jumped in front of a train. And at which point I was like, well, what hospital is he in? And they said, well, there is no hospital. He's dead. And then they sent a police car to come pick me up. And then, to be honest, the rest is just a complete blur. And then life had to go on after that. Do
you think you had any sort of kind of inkling that it was him from earlier on in the day?
It's strange looking back. I must have had some inkling. Otherwise, why would I have bothered going there? But I thought that I was sort of just ticking a box just to make sure that like I'd covered every avenue, just like ringing around all the hospitals, all of that type of stuff. But at no point did I genuinely believe that he tried to kill himself. It just wasn't in his. I didn't think it was in his character.
So it was total shock to you.
Complete shock. Complete shock, surprise, devastation. It still is a shock 15 years later. I share this with my wife every now and then. There's a part of me that believes that one day I'm going to be on holiday in the Caribbean somewhere and I'm going to see some guy on a beach and it's going to be him because he faked his death or something like that. And there is still a part of me that believes that. I couldn't bring myself to identify the body. So I actually haven't confirmed in my own mind 100% that he's dead, if that makes sense.
So how did you deal with the fallout, in the time after? Because I mean, it's such a kind of violent act, I guess, and such a shock. Do you think you were in shock yourself for a period of time? You must have been.
I went into survival mode, if I'm perfectly honest, because I essentially was now the man of the family. So I had, I took it upon myself to try and figure everything out for everyone. And I was essentially a robot, just going through the motions. There was a lot of, admin and paperwork and God knows what else that had to be dealt with after, the bankruptcy and everything that came with that and people chasing for money. And then I had the press all over me. I mean, it was on the front page of the Evening Standard. He died on the Wednesday. It was on the front page of the Evening Standard on the Friday. And I was so embarrassed and shamed, and we look very, very similar. So his face was on the front page of the Evening Standard. And I actually went to work that Friday, to be honest. And on my way home from work that day, I wore a balaclava because I just didn't want to be recognized because of the stigma surrounding a suicide and the way in which he did it and all of these sorts of things. And then I went through I went through the roughest 9-10 months of my life. That looking back now is a blur. I was going out all night drinking to mask the pain, not practicing self-help, back then there weren't signposts and there weren't ways of which getting help, unlike today, thankfully. I was when on that night that he passed, I was given a leaflet basically signposting to one charity that it was, it's called SOBS. It's still around, Survivors of Bereavement of Suicide. And that was it. And then I was left to my own devices. And I went through a complete downward negative spiral to the point where I was in self-destruct mode. My mum revealed to me a few years ago that she thought I was going to die. I was in that bad a state. I got kicked out of my home because, the home was in his name. He got bankrupt. That was it. My flat was gone. And for a 22-year-old who had only finished university 3 months prior to that and who'd grown up in this life of luxury and being mollycoddled and had cotton wool wrapped around him I had never experienced the real world. And, I don't want any sympathy for that. That was, the life that my parents gave me. But I went from that to literally, right, you're on your own 2 feet and now you've got to handle all this other stuff that's come with it overnight. And that was just completely overwhelming for anyone, I guess. But, I got through it.
Did you look for help? I know you said you got a pathetic leaflet at the time, but did you share? I mean, I guess if you were feeling that you were having to take on the responsibility, perhaps of the family, did you not feel you could share or go seeking help, or were you not even in that frame of mind at that point?
I don't think I was even in that frame of mind. I was, I wanted to inherit some of that toxic masculinity from my dad. I don't need help. I don't need to talk to anyone. That's not me. And I'll tell you a story that will tell you a lot. At Dad's funeral, which was a week after he died, there must have been 2,000 people there. And, people were sort of queuing outside to pay their respects. And I got up and I read this eulogy. And I said to myself while reading the eulogy, do not cry. Do not cry in front of all these people. And now looking back, how powerful would it have been if I did cry? And I showed a bit of vulnerability, and I was honest with these people that I'm a 22-year-old boy who's just had his life flipped upside down and lost his dad. And I'm struggling and I need help, but I didn't. And I wore that like a badge of honor. I was so proud. I remember a friend of mine saying to me, how did you find I can't remember the exact words, but someone saying, how did you find the funeral? Probably wasn't the right words, but, he sort of asked me about it. And I said, yeah, it was fine. I didn't even cry. Why did I say that? Like, it's just crazy looking back on it. So no, I very much wore it as a badge of honor, and I didn't seek help at all from anyone. And it was only until my boss at the time realized what I was essentially doing, going out all night, partying, drinking, doing God knows what else, that said, he said to me, you do need help and I'm going to get it for you and I will pay for it. And that's what happened.
So that was your turning point, was it? Your tipping point?
No, it wasn't actually. It really wasn't. So he booked me onto sort of like a residential, a week-long sort of course to help me, I suppose. And that wasn't until October. So I had a few months before that had started. And it just so happened that at the beginning of September, I met my wife. So that's 9 months after Dad died. And I was at a dinner party and I started talking to her. And within about 5 minutes, I told her what happened. And for some reason, she carried on talking to me. I mean, she met the stranger who kind of outpoured his whatever was going on in his life, which was obviously pretty bad at that point. And we started dating. And it got very serious very quickly. And then I had to tell her that I had to go away to this sort of center for a week. But the turning point was very much meeting my wife. She probably won't admit it, but she sort of gave me a reason to smile again. And gave me hope that there was life after this tragedy and I could make a life for myself. And so I went with it. And yeah, that was 14 years ago and we're still together today, have 2 beautiful children. And yeah, I essentially owe her my life.
So after you met your wife and you went on the intensive course, did you then start to, change your attitude? I mean, I'm not surprised that you had this, deeply ingrained attitude around, being very masculine and not crying and keeping it all together, etc. But did those 2 events, did they change your approach to how you should, lead your life from this point onwards?
The 2 events, you mean meeting my wife and going away? No one's ever asked me that before. I'm almost a bit taken aback by the question. Did I think? No is the answer. No, I did not. That did not create a sort of, oh wow, I need to change everything. I naturally, because was in a relationship and, I was busy, I naturally had stopped sort of going out all night and drinking and yeah, I did sort of rein that in pretty heavily after the course. But I don't think it was a conscious decision. I think it was more like I never went teetotal or anything like that. It was just more, well, I'm happier now, so I can sort of progress my life in a more positive way. But there was no sort of like overnight change, if that makes sense.
So it's more organic, really, over the years, and then you started your own family. So then, when we talked before, you said it took you, kind of 10 years to get to the point, perhaps, where you decided to become more involved in mental health. So how did that happen? What were the triggers there?
Okay, it's an interesting journey. So in the early part, whenever I spoke about what happened, so let's say, a year on, whenever I spoke about what happened, friends, or even family or work colleagues, I got greeted with silence, awkwardness, uncomfort. People just didn't want to talk about what happened because it was awkward. People found it a stigma. So I stopped talking about it. And I bottled it up inside, and I did not say a word to anyone for 10 years. And, even when I work in the property industry. My dad was in the property industry. He was quite a big character. So whenever I would sort of go to meetings and people would notice my surname, they would ask me if I was Paul's son. And obviously that was met with awkwardness as well. So when I left my job and started at a new firm and I sort of wanted a fresh start in life, I didn't tell anyone. So no one knew who I was, what had happened. And that was quite, nice in a way at the time. And then this is where the coincidences happen, and it sort of happened by mistake. We went into lockdown in COVID. I'd always really liked giving back and doing charity challenges. So, for example, before Dad died, we'd arranged to climb Kilimanjaro that Christmas on behalf of the charity Children with Cancer. And when he died, I did it anyway. I did it on my own. And it was the most incredible experience. Loved every minute of it and got a real buzz out of giving back to charity. So I hadn't done anything like that since climbing Kilimanjaro. So rewind back to November 2010. I'd always wanted to grow a kick-ass moustache for Movember without actually understanding what Movember was. And my wife had always strongly discouraged it because she didn't want me to look like a tit. And then I said to her, well, did you know Movember's a mental health charity? They support, people going through, they support suicide prevention. Maybe I can do this in honor of my dad, because it just so happens that it's the 10-year anniversary this year during COVID, and I don't have to go out, so no one's going to see me with a moustache because it's COVID. So she said, okay, of course. And I remember on November the 1st, 2010, I put up a very, I don't know how to describe it, casual social media post along the lines of, I lost my dad to suicide 10 years ago, and now I'm raising money for Movember because it's a mental health charity. And I got so much positive feedback. I got donations and amazing comments and lovely messages, and it all felt so warm and positive. And like I was making, I had people outreaching saying, I feel, inspired by my bravery, and, you're going to help people and all of this sort of stuff. And I never thought anything of this. I wasn't doing it for that, for the egotistic. I was genuinely doing it because I just wanted to grow a cool moustache, and the sort of mental health side of things nicely coincided. And I think by the end of day 3, I'd raised £2,500. And I decided to kind of really, really go for it. And then on the 17th of November 2020, I decided to write an account of what had happened on that day and publish it. And I told people before I was going to do it that I was going to do it. And a lot of people said, well, you can't do that. It's too graphic. It's too triggering. And I said, you know what? I don't care, because it happened to me and it's a real story. And if people don't want to read it, they don't have to. But I think it's important that people understand what happened. And that's what I did. And that year I was the highest fundraiser in the UK. I raised over £16,000, and it all sort of started from there, really. And I think that month was the month that I realized that I can turn this traumatic, horrendous event that happened to me into something positive. And not just positive for other people, but positive for me. Because it helped me turn my life around. I find it extremely cathartic talking about these things. And it's almost like a sense of therapy, I suppose, to some extent. But yeah, and then it sort of all span off from there. Movember asked me to become an ambassador, to travel around the country, sharing my story, raising money, promoting Movember. And I absolutely loved it. I did it for 3 years. And yeah, it's a really, really positive part of my life.
And so you become a mental health ambassador, been working with Movember. And then what happened next?
And then a weird chain of events happened. So I was booked to go on holiday, and I can't remember why, but it had to get cancelled on the same day. And my housemate, who was living with me at the time that Dad died, is a film director. And he wrote a short film and was showing it that night that I was supposed to go away. Originally, I couldn't go, and because I wasn't going away anymore, I went. And it was a beautiful film. He has lost both his parents to cancer, and he did a film around bereavement and what it's like to be bereaved. And I said to him after the film, I was like, suicide's a very different type of bereavement. Why don't we do a film about suicide bereavement? And we did. And we raised the money. We, did focus groups. It's like we wanted to make it really raw and authentic and real, and it was really going to touch people. So we made sure we really did the research. Several iterations of the script showed it to people who had been bereaved by suicide. And then partnered with a charity called Suicide & Co., who are one of the only charities in the UK who provide specific bereavement counselling for those bereaved by suicide. And they were the perfect partner, to be perfectly honest. They were the perfect partner. They advised us on the storyline of the film and how to make it touch more people. And yeah, this film was released about 3 weeks ago. So it's really, really sort of fresh, and I'm so sort of touched and overwhelmed and enamored by the comments I've got and the people reaching out to me about this film. How it's the aim of the film was to touch people who didn't feel they deserved to be able to be touched and bereaved, because a lot of the attention in the suicide prevention space is on the person who's died and the trouble and trauma they were going through. But what the film is supposed to tell you is that trauma passes down. So I don't know if you've heard the saying, but suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And the film is called Heirlooms, essentially because I feel that trauma is an heirloom that is passed down. And the message of the film is break that cycle. So Suicide & Co.'s research suggests that 36,000 people per year are directly bereaved by suicide per year. The way that works is currently between sort of 5,000 to 6,000 people take their own life each year in the UK. Of those 5,000 to 6,000 people, you're directly related to, on average, 5 to 6 direct relatives of that person. 36,000 people directly bereaved by suicide each year. Of those 36,000 people bereaved by suicide, 33% of them will have suicidal thoughts. So that's 30. So that's an extra, quick maths here, about 8,000 people, who are having suicidal thoughts, who essentially shouldn't be having those suicidal thoughts, who weren't destined to have those suicidal thoughts. Now, of those 36,000 people, around 10% will try and kill themselves. So this film that I wanted to create was to make people who had been bereaved by suicide show that unique element of that bereavement, make them feel understood, make them feel seen, and signpost them to getting help via Suicide & Co. to break that cycle of trauma.
I've seen the film. There's a 3-minute version, then there's the full 8-minute version, and we'll put links in so people can watch those. But it's incredibly powerful. You talk about this concept of heirlooms. Perhaps you could just elaborate a bit more on the story between, I think it's from grandfather's son to grandson.
I don't want to give too much away. I do want people to watch it, but it essentially follows the life of a very troubled young man, and you don't really know why he's troubled. You just know something's going wrong. And yeah, you'll have to watch it and find out the rest. But it essentially, it goes through his life and different and when you do watch the film, all those points in his life happen to me, and those specific points happen to me, and I'm sure a version of all of those points has happened to someone bereaved by suicide. And we wanted to sort of make it as relatable as possible, so that it does sort of touch everyone in the right way. But yeah, you'll have to watch it to find out a little bit more. But that's all I'm giving away for now.
Right. Well, we'll put the links in. So let me ask you a question then about, you're a father now yourself. How does that perhaps change the way, or how does that help? How does that impact the way that you view your experience, with your father? Does it change anything?
It really does. And there's a constant battle so my eldest son is 7, and he has got no grandfathers. He's lost both his grandfathers. My wife's father died 4 years ago, and he was old enough to know what was going on during that death. He had a very close relationship with her father. And my wife talks about her father a lot to my son. I don't talk about my dad ever. Because I'm a bit scared, to be honest. I'm scared that he's going to ask how he died. And I'm scared to have that conversation with a 7-year-old. And so I'm just sort of biding my time. I'm going to wait and see what happens. But I really hope that I have dealt with the trauma that happened to me. And I really hope that I have not passed that trauma. I'm doing my best not to pass that trauma down at all. So yeah, I suppose we'll see what happens over the next few years. But it's a really difficult conundrum. Like how do you explain to a 7-year-old that someone didn't want to be on this planet anymore, that someone wanted, actively made the decision to end their own life and leave their family behind? Because that is, it's quite traumatic. So yeah, it's definitely made me think a lot about fatherhood and how to be a father and how to set an example in terms of showing your vulnerability and not holding on to this trauma, basically. And,
the discussion around suicide is still quite taboo, really. It's still and difficult. And I can appreciate what you're saying. It's quite difficult to bring that into a young child's life without them having perhaps developmentally the skills to deal with it. But generally, with adults, it's still a very taboo subject. And, it's quite difficult to say, well, let's normalize it, because that's the wrong thing to say. But, I guess through what you're doing with the film and the work that you do, and, is it I'm assuming you think it's a good thing to raise awareness so that people are far more engaged with it as something that can happen to anyone?
Oh, 100%. If it wasn't my son, I'd be telling everyone to tell him straight away. But but I, I'm guilty of, to some extent, not practicing what I preach, because I genuinely have not got the courage to have that conversation with him. Do I think I should have that conversation with him? Absolutely. Am I being a coward? Probably. But I don't think I'm ready to do it yet. I will do it. And in terms of you talking about stigma and normalizing conversation, 100%. So I was at a conference last week, the Suicide & Co conference, actually, where I was lucky enough to be invited to speak on a panel. And that panel was entitled Breaking the Stigma. And what we discussed on that panel was, how can you use different medium to break the stigma and to essentially open up suicide prevention and bereavement awareness to a group of people who you probably haven't accessed before. Obviously, I was talking about the film and the way in which I portrayed it using film, but there was podcasters on there as well talking about how they use humor to break the ice. Essentially dark humor, but it works. They both run very, very popular podcasts. And what I challenged on that panel and in that room full of professionals who know a lot more about this type of subject than I do, but they were in the panel before mine, they were talking about boundaries and how we need to put specific boundaries in place it was more around the sort of therapist-client relationship in terms of that sort of boundary. But they did speak about boundaries in terms of the level of content that we can show to people. And just like I said earlier in our conversation, best practice probably says that story that I published isn't fit for public consumption, because it talked about method, it talked about, a lot of it is quite triggering and raw and real. My view on it, rightly or wrongly, it happened. Don't shy away from it. And essentially that's what I'm doing for my son. I'm protecting my son and I'm shying him away from it. But if we shy away from these subjects and we put blinkers on and we shield people from the real truth, that's creating a stigma in itself. So maybe we all need to look at society in terms of our trigger warnings and what we get triggered by. We have to get really comfortable being uncomfortable, essentially. That's the only way to break the stigma. And those people who told me that I shouldn't publish my story, I hope they've rethinked that and understood that it did go a long way, certainly in my community and with the people who follow my story, to breaking that stigma.
And that's the essence of this podcast, actually, is to make the uncomfortable comfortable and stop sugarcoating things, because it doesn't help. Let me ask you one last question then, Will. What advice would you give to somebody in a similar situation to you? Perhaps they are at a very early stage since the loss of somebody, or perhaps they're just feeling a bit lost and don't really know how to come to terms with it. What would you advise based on your experience?
Everyone's journey is different. So what worked for me might not work for someone else. But if I was to go back in time and relive my journey again, I wouldn't have stayed silent for 10 years. I wouldn't have been ashamed of what had happened to me, because it wasn't my fault. And I would have spoken about it a lot more. And I'd have started working from November earlier, and I'd have done all these things that have, taken me so long to realize they would help me. It really does help to talk and to open up about it, because the unique thing about suicide that is not like losing a loved one to cancer, it's that they have decided that they don't want to be on this planet anymore. And that's a really hard thing for someone left behind to deal with. That you weren't enough. You weren't enough to keep them on this planet. And that's the message that's constantly in your head. And it's not true, because it's not your fault that that person has chosen to end things for themselves. They were going through something incredibly difficult in their own mind. And most of the time, people will look back and say, well, I could have done X, Y, and Z. But realistically, once someone's made that decision, they're gonna follow through with it. And there's not a lot you can do to stop it. So I would give, the advice I'd give to anyone is, yes, talk about it, be open, be vulnerable. Don't blame yourself, because it's not your fault.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for being really open and honest, and really powerful story. And thank you for spending time talking to us today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. And as Philip said, everything, you can find everything on my website, which is willcastle.com. Very, very easy. And please look, if my inbox is always open. If anyone does need any help or advice or signposting, you'll find my contact details on my website. And please, honestly, please do reach out if you need to.
Thank you. And we'll put all those links at the end of the podcast as well. Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you can relate to any of the issues Will discussed in this episode, or if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, there are organisations you can call now. For example, the Samaritans in the UK on 116 123. And if you're in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you want to find out more about Will, visit his website, willcastle.com, and you can also watch his short film Heirlooms. To find out more about the support available from Suicide & Co., the bereavement by suicide charity, visit suicideandco.org. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please do get in contact, either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. If you enjoyed listening, then please do rate and review the podcast, help raise its profile. And finally, there's now a book available called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, which is based on some of the stories from the podcast and is available on Amazon and from other online bookstores.